material to go over, because now we're getting into the thick of it, right? I've been telling all of my freshmen. At this point, week 3 of the semester, it's like there's no more easing into the work, nothing like that. It's all, okay, read this, write this, and it's no stopping. So let me share real quick my screen. By the way, in the class right before you guys, I had a problem with my Zoom where I couldn't see anything, like the Zoom screen just went white on me. So if that happens, I might be able to make one of you a host of the Zoom so I can leave and come back and see if that fixes the screen. But I'm hoping that we'll be good in here. Okay, so for our class, oh, the dogs are off. Waiting for it to load. So this week we have the one reading and then the discussion board post. So hopefully today I will be able to answer all of these discussion board posts for you all. Some of these you can already answer because I talked about these last week. And by the way, for some of you, I'm noticing, because I graded the first discussion board post, some of you are not realizing that I record all of these Zoom sessions, right? So, and I do try to answer almost every single question from the discussion board post on our Zooms. So you can pull up the Zoom recording and watch it or listen to it while you're answering the questions. Because especially if like you missed something in the reading or didn't do the reading, like it's not cheating. I'm posting the recordings and I'll show you. So last week, for example, week 2, I have the link for the Zoom, and then this is where I post the link to the recorded class. So you can click on the link for either Monday or Wednesday, and it will take you to YouTube, and that's where I've posted our recordings, right? So don't make things harder on yourself. If you're not taking good enough notes during class, go back and watch the recordings. Because I've posted the links on YouTube, you can watch them at 2 times speed, 3 times speed, skip around, do whatever you need to, so that you get the answers to the questions. I don't like taking points off. But I'm like, I can't make you write something or know something you don't, but hint, it's there. You also notice that by the end of week 5, you're going to have your first paper to write for me. So if writing papers worries you, or you want to look ahead, you can go back and go forward to week 5 and read the primary source there. And I'll also start making the rest of the weeks live. But if you're like me and like to just take it 1 week at a time, today, it's our only class meeting for the week. So we're gonna focus on what is really one of the biggest questions in world history, right? For some of you in the first discussion board post, I might have taken points up or made comments about your answer to the question about how Europeans came to dominate so much of the world, because I really want you to have the answer to this. Right? And it's a complex question with a complex answer. It's not just one thing, right? In history, we hate simple answers of like it's one thing, right? We always have to be complex and give you multiple parts to it. But this one genuinely does have multiple parts to the answer, right? And the question is how. This cannot be ignored. The Europeans came to dominate so much of the world, right, through colonialism and imperialism. And the question, why was it them, is really important. And so let me go to the PowerPoint and again, this one is linked. I do have the PowerPoint file on Canvas if anybody likes to like print out slides and do that. But so multiple historians have tried to answer this question. I talked about this book last week. It's Gun, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond. It still is a very popular book. It sold at bookstores. But there, Jared Diamond was really arguing that a lot of the reasons why Europe comes to dominate so much can be explained by geography. Right? He says, no, it was not that the Europeans were better because they were white. That's not the answer, but he says it was a geographical accident, right? They end up with better guns, with germs, and with steel, and that gives them the upper hand in terms of controlling populations in the Americas, but also in Africa and Asia. And I already told you, I don't know if anybody remembers, but I like part of his argument. I think he's not wrong about part of it, but I don't think he's giving us the full answer, right? I think I talked a lot about how guns, some of the, European guns were superior, but Native people also had the advantage of territory. So, and there were battles that were won by Native people. So I don't think the answer of guns gives you a full explanation of what helped the Europeans win here. But germs is definitely a big part of the answer. Why did Europeans come to dominate so much of the world? Part of it is germs, especially in the Americas, where germs just devastate the native population. Right? Makes it easier to control the land, to control the population when the population diminishes significantly. The rest of the answer, though, of how Europe comes to dominate so much really requires more of an economic analysis and a comparison of Europe and China, right? And for a long time, you really didn't have anybody who could even do this kind of work, right? Because you need to be able to look at the Chinese sources and the European sources. And for those of you that are history majors and maybe are thinking about graduate school, typically when you go to graduate school, you specialize in something very narrow, right? Like you study Europe, but you study one country in Europe, one specific date or one specific thing that happened in Europe. And usually that doesn't require that you know any Chinese history or a lot of, or any kind of the Chinese dialects. So you didn't have people who had the skills to be able to do a comparison between Europe and China until Ken Pomerantz comes along, and he is able to compare a lot of the economic factors happening around 1750 that help us understand why wasn't China, right? I've already made the case to you that China had everything the Europeans had earlier, right? The things that give Europeans the advantage in the Americas, China had. So looking again at why isn't China that ends up dominating so much of the world, Ken Pomerantz gives us the answer to it, right? But to go back just a little bit, what are the advantages that China had before 1750, right? So from about like 1200 or 1300 to 1750, China would have been one of the most dominant regions in the world. India was pretty powerful as well, but India was still very fractured, right? India wasn't one place, right? India was controlled by different groups of people. And so it didn't have the same kind of political and military unity that you end up having in China that made it really powerful and could have led them to dominate the world. One of the most important things that China had was efficient agricultural methods. Right? Why is that? Why would that be key to making a country really prosperous and powerful? How does agriculture factor in, do you think?
Better crops to trade with.
Better crops to trade with. Yeah, that is definitely part of it. The other part of it is the ability to feed a bigger population, right? When you can feed a population, then your population can grow, right? There's no point in you having a large country with tons of people if they're dying of hunger, right? That doesn't help the country be powerful or be, or it does not help the country grow. But they did. They had very efficient agricultural methods. Yeah, is that a question or a comment? Maybe not. Okay. But on top of that, so they had figured out all kinds of methods that made agricultural produce more, right? Food was plentiful, so you're able to feed the population and actually have extra to trade. But all these new agricultural methods were also being spread around, like knowledge of how to grow crops better is spread all over China. And China is a big place, right? Even at the time, it's not even at the size that it is today. And China was a huge place. So it really isn't as significant if one part of China has advanced agricultural methods and no other part of China has them, right? Is the equivalent of like having let's say California develops some innovative, great technology, and we keep it to ourselves. Nobody else knows about our technology. Well, what good does that do? It can do some good here, but not going to help the country. It's not going to help the world. What China does under the Song dynasty is they appoint farming experts to go from region to region in China, spreading knowledge and taking technology from one place to the other. That is really key, right? The spread of information. They're in part also able to do this because they have an early version of the printing press. So they don't have to reproduce documents by hand. They can just print them. And then the experts can go from one place to the other, showing diagrams to the farmers showing them exactly what they need to do in order to produce more and better crops. On top of it, under the Song dynasty, the dynasty offers tax breaks to anybody willing to farm new land or to invest in like new farming technology. Right, so the government would give farmers who are willing to invest and take that risk a tax break and a low interest loan. These are things we still do today, right, to help the agricultural sector. Right, is they need money. They need just not just the knowledge and the technology, but the ability to put it into action. And the Song dynasty does that. As a result, the population around the year 800 was about 50 to 60 million people in China. Too many ones. By the year, no, did I actually correct it? Yes, by the year 1110, the population had grown to 120 million people. That is a significant jump in terms of population numbers, especially for this time period. You don't see this kind of population jump anywhere else in the world. And so China is growing, and it's growing really, really quickly this early on. Right, so it speaks to how well the Chinese are doing and how poised they were by the time we get to the 14 and 1500s to take over the world. Right, they're building a power base with their farming technology and then the huge increase in population. Right, and by the way, once they get to this point of 120 million, they're still being able to feed people. Like, they're going to have some problems later on, but they can support a population that is that big. Some of the key pieces of technology that they have, right, is, I said, they have a new farming technology. So among the key things they had in technology were the use of manure, right, as a fertilizer. That was brand new. And most of the rest of the world was not really using that as a manure as a fertilizer. They're using it, and they're using it in large numbers. They also are developing hydraulic irrigation techniques and other ways of getting water to the crops so that you can actually farm pieces of land that are not right next to a body of water. So that's also really key to sustaining productive farming, right, is a source of water. In fact, that's one of the huge problems we have in California is water, right? Because our farming sector uses so much water that we can't find enough water in California, right? We have to bring in water from other places. And so the Chinese are working on that problem through all kinds of new hydraulic and irrigation techniques at the time. They're also using crop specialization. Right, so these are all things that are still in use and existence in modern day farming. And the Chinese have it before the year 1200. Right? Before the year 1200, the Chinese are already doing kind of early versions of all of the modern farming techniques. They also have a few other really important key things. They have coal. They were using coal, mining the coal and using it to manufacture iron. That was really important because in order to melt the iron, you need it to be really hot. You need a heat that's really strong. And coal provides that heat source. For the Chinese, it means they don't have to cut down as many trees to manufacture iron. Instead, they mine the coal. I'll come back to this, but keep that in mind. They're mining coal before 1200. Nobody else in the world is mining coal. Okay, but we're going to come back to that. Their iron production goes up because of the use of coal. It goes up from 19,000 metric tons to 113 metric tons. You can see that's way more than doubling their iron production. Right, so when we talk about like the Europeans having the advantage of iron when they come to the Americas, their iron production was nothing compared to what the Chinese were doing. The Chinese have the iron to produce the weapons, to produce all kinds of manufacturing. They already have it. Right? They're also minting coin. The Chinese are minting the coin currency. It goes up by 4,500%. Why is that important? Why is it? How would it make a difference that the Chinese are minting a lot of coins? How does that help them? Any guesses? I'm like, or do I have any economists?
Well, they finally have a means of trading without trading any personal items. They can now trade something of monetary value.
Yeah, instead of like trading goods for goods, right? Trading in kind, you can use coins to trade, right? And at this point in the world, we're talking about, 1100s, 1200s. That's still pretty new. It just makes trading easier, so much easier when you can just pay with coins instead of having something else to barter. It means that trade is going to increase, your economy is going to flourish. Now, Christopher is bringing up in the chat inflation. They managed to print that much more currency, right? That much more coin without the problem of inflation. They don't, when they're doing this at this time, they don't have an inflation problem. Why? Because their economy can sustain all that minting of the coins. Right? There's enough trade. There's a huge demand in Chinese goods. And so it's not a problem at the time. They'll have inflation problems later on, but at this point, that is not a problem here. So they can keep minting coin for the time being without it being an economic problem. Right? In terms of military power, they discover gunpowder. Right? The only reason the rest of the world has gunpowder is because the Chinese do it. And so, in terms of like the guns and the tools that are going to be superior to those of the rest of the world, the Chinese have them. Right? They also begin mechanized textile production. So an early version of what a factory is in England, right? They have this early factory. They also have the compass, which we already talked about, helps them navigate the oceans. And they have an early printing press, right? So the Europeans were not the first to develop the printing press. Basically, everything that is later going to give the Europeans the upper hand The Chinese already have it. So then the other thing historians have said is colonies, right? All right, so all that technology that the Europeans have, the Chinese have, and they have it earlier. Okay, what about colonies though? Because we know that the colonies give the British in particular, but the Europeans in general, the upper hand, right? It really is. Having those American colonies is a huge boost to the Europeans. The Chinese did have colonies in Southeast Asia. They had sent people to those colonies. The problem for the Chinese is that their colonies provide very limited resources to them, right? Like the Chinese were looking for more resources, but their colonies are not providing as much. And on top of it, the Chinese lose contact with the colonies, right? Because China turns inward, right? There are military conflicts within China, political unrest. And so instead of focusing on building its colonies and its resources outside of China, China turns inward and it focuses on domestic issues. They lose touch with the colonies, right? This is where some of this Chinese populations all over Southeast Asia, ethnic Chinese populations, can trace their history like way, way back. But so the colonies don't end up giving China the same kind of boost that the American colonies will give the Europeans, right? The American colonies give the Europeans control over the sugar, tobacco, and cotton production, right? Because all those plantations are controlled by Europeans. That's resources that they can just make money off of it. Because the native population is so devastated, they're also able to just cut down as much trees as they want in the Americas, right? Which gives them also that energy source they needed, because they had run out of wood in England. Right, so the colonies are a huge part of what allows the Europeans to control parts of the rest of the world. Right? Not only are they in control of the Americas, but they're also going to be engaging in colonial projects in Africa and Asia, all over the world. And they're able to engage in those projects all over the rest of the world because of the resources in the Americas. Right? So at this point, then, the whole world is connected. What happens in one place of the world has ripple effect everywhere else. From this point on, we're going to see these interconnections, right? Sometimes the ripple effect might be limited, but it has a ripple effect, right? Because the world economy is fully connected, and the politics and the military are going to be just as connected as this. So then, part of the reason then that the Europeans can gain so much power then is disease, right? We said disease is one of the things that gives the Europeans a lot of advantage, right? The next big thing that gives the Europeans power and makes them be the ones that control so much of the world instead of China is the colonies. It's the colonies, right? So we have disease, and it's the American colonies. Right? The next big thing, I'm just going to mention it. We're going to come back to it because we don't have time to spend time analyzing it right now. But we have to come back to coal and industrialization is going to be, without this, Europe is powerful, but they wouldn't have been able to do exactly everything they did, right? Is the Industrial Revolution. And you don't have an Industrial Revolution without coal. Now, can the British control how much coal they have? No. Coal is a natural resource. It's either there or it's not. And you can't, it takes a ton of time for coal to even exist, right? But when we run out, we run out of coal. It's not something that is renewable, right? And yeah, Vic, it's finite. It's very finite. But initially, the British begin digging around and they find coal reserves pretty much everywhere in England. They find these coal deposits all over their little island, right? And because it's an island, it means they can get to their coal really easy. Right? They can mine coal very easily in England. It's easy to get to, and then they develop the technology that makes it easier to extract the coal from the ground. One of the problems with coal deposits is that a lot of time there's a lot of water where you find the coal, and they basically create a machine that takes the water out of the where you find the coal. Like a lot too much detail than you need. What you need to know is that the Industrial Revolution helps the Europeans, surpass everyone else in the world. But I told you the Chinese have coal too. Right? I told you they have coal way back when. They're mining that coal centuries before the British. So why is there no industrial revolution at that point in China?
I think it was because it was just kept in China, and revolution or industrialization or revolution implies that it exists elsewhere and it is growing elsewhere, whereas China only had it for themselves.
So that is part of the answer. The other part of the answer is just the location of the coal. China is a huge place, but they had only found the coal in one place, and it was near, it was in northern China. But when, because of internal turmoil and some environmental disasters within China, the Chinese center of government, which had been in northern China, moves to the south, which means that the whole government administration, the bureaucracy, grows and exists only in southern China, or primarily in southern China. The coal is way up in northern China. It's just not easy to get to. And also the Chinese stopped mining for coal. They just stop. In part, they don't need it as badly as the British needed, right? The British had already used up all the wood in their island. The British needed a new source of energy or they would be out of luck. It would be disastrous. It was already having disastrous consequences in England. The Chinese don't really need to industrialize. In fact, they need to not industrialize so that people have enough jobs to support their economy. Right? Because if they industrialize, then the machines are going to take over a lot of the jobs people were doing in their homes. And the Chinese, because their population is so huge, they can't afford to do that. So they actually don't have an incentive to industrialize. There's no incentive for industrialization. They need jobs for everybody. England, it's an island, and they actually need the coal as a source of energy, and their economy desperately needs something new. Right? So the first industry in that begins kind of industrializing in Britain is going to be the textile industry. So making of cheap cloth. Anyways, we'll come back to that. For now, you just need to know coal is going to give the British the upper hand. But notice, for any of you that might know a little bit of your European history, then when it comes to industrialization, not everybody in Europe industrializes. Right? In fact, arguably, there are places in Europe that still have very limited industrialization. Right? Like in France, in Spain, it's still largely an agricultural based economy. So this upper hand, this huge boost does not get distributed equally amongst the Europeans. It's really the Industrial Revolution is going to help propel the British into global power above the Spanish, above the Portuguese, above the French and the Dutch. Right? It's going to be the British because they industrialize first. The other big boost for the Europeans that I wanted to focus a little bit more on is slavery. right? Because it provides that source of labor for their plantations, right? A source of labor that is cheap because you just have to do the one initial payment for the slave, and then you get a lifetime of forced labor. Right? And in fact, if you can afford a plantation, slaves were pretty cheap. If you have that kind of money, slaves were cheap to buy. They weren't really, not everybody can own slaves, but if you have a plantation, it's really easy. This is why, by the way, when we talk about the Atlantic slave trade and how horrible it was, sometimes you might think, wait, why are they treating these people so badly? Like hundreds of slaves would die on the ship just on their way to the Americas. So why wouldn't the Europeans be better at like taking care of the slaves on their way to the Americas? On the plantations, why wouldn't they feed the slaves better, clothe them, give them better access to health care? And part of the answer is it was cheaper to buy a new slave than to take care of the ones you had. Right? It would have just been cheaper. And then you add in the element of they were not human, they were property. Right. Now, this is a new element here when we talk about slavery. Slavery had already existed all over the world, right? Almost every part of the world had some form of slavery. But the Atlantic slave trade is something new, not because of the enslavement factor, it's because of how harsh it was, how badly treated the slaves were on plantations, and because it's based on race. Right? Because all of these slaves that the Europeans are taking to the Americas come primarily from West Africa, and they're Black. Right? They have Black skin, and you have to justify this slavery. And the reason the Europeans come up with is the difference in skin color. So they develop a racism to support a system of slavery, right? Yes, slaves all over the world, Vic. So beforehand, I mean, slavery existed everywhere. It existed in China, it existed in Africa, it existed in the Americas. Like native populations would enslave other native populations. In Europe, there were slaves, but typically the enslaved person became a slave by losing a war. So it's a kind of like prisoners of war. You lose a war, and so if you lost, whoever's left alive becomes a slave. So it was a sense of like an other, right? These are people who have lost a war, and therefore they are slaves now. But it was not based on skin color. Right? Oftentimes the slave owner had the same skin color as the slave. What we see with the Atlantic slave trade is not that. Right? It's okay. We have slaves that are coming from West Africa. They have a different skin color. And so now we develop a whole ideology to justify that. And that ideology is this racism, anti-Black racism. Right? And we'll talk more about that, right? I'm like, these are huge concepts, right? huge concepts. Usually we could spend the whole class just talking about the whole semester, just talking about the system of slavery and how it's done. But we have to bring it all together, right? It all comes together, and it's not quick, it's a process, right? Because the control of the Americans does not happen quickly, but it happens because, to remind you, some of the limitations the Americas have, combined with the factor of disease, right? The Columbian Exchange is part of that, giving how the American colonies end up giving the Europeans the upper hand, right? As a result of all that coming together, right? Colonization of the Americas, the use of slave labor, in the Industrial Revolution. You put all that together, and what you get is that the Europeans become producers, the movers, and the consumers of goods. They become the center of global trade. right? Because they have the product that the world wants, right? They have the tobacco, the cotton, the sugar, the coffee. They control all of that. They're the ones transporting it all over the world. And there's also a high demand in Europe for all of that. You start getting coffee houses everywhere in Europe. So just the fact that coffee is accessible to even the poorest Europeans, that sugar is accessible, that they can get cheap clothes, and it's all interconnected, right? So all of it ends up transforming Europe, right? It's actually gonna change European life significantly. It transforms the African continent, right? It means honestly the in Africa, it was the economies of Africa were extremely diverse, right? There are natural resources in different parts of Africa that made its economy super diverse. But because of the demand for slaves, basically most of the Western African economies are going to focus on slavery only. That's how Western African countries are going to make all their money, and the whole economy ends up centering on this, just on the slave trade. There's a couple of crash courses that I've linked in here. If you're into the crash courses, or when you're studying for like these on these topics, I think the crash courses do a really good job of summarizing a lot of those points. John Green tends to talk really fast in those videos, but he does give you very good information. Most people are familiar with that. But then, okay, this is the question I keep coming back to then. If we just went over all the main points of what gives Europe the upper hand in these global processes, then you guys need to tell me again, you have enough to answer the question, why wasn't it China? So I'm asking you a version of the same question, right? I said, I'm not asking you why Europe, I'm asking you why not China?
It had to do with the location of where the coal was exactly. It was further north, and it wasn't accessible to the world. It was only accessible to the Chinese, and so they kept the coal to themselves, and they didn't have enough coal mines for them to industrialize. And quite frankly, they didn't really need to.
There we go. They have the coal, but they're not mining it to the same extent that the British are. They don't need to, and so the coal just stays there. It just stays there in China. And they had really only discovered the coal in one place. Later on, they'll discover it everywhere. But for that point being, yeah. So part of it is that they're not using the coal to industrialize. Christopher is giving us another part of the answer there. Why not China? So part of it is coal and the lack of industrialization. The other part is they're not interested in controlling the rest of the world. Yeah, they had the ships, right? They had the superior ships to navigate to the Americas, even though they don't know the Americas are there, but they had it. But because of internal conflict, that they don't become interested in kind of colonial projects beyond what they already had in Southeast Asia. Their colonies weren't giving them enough anyway, but they turn inward and they lose touch with their colonies, and they're only interested in making more colonies. Some of it is, just internal focus. Anything else? So those are the main ones we've talked about. Those are the main ones. If I ask you in an exam, why not China? Those would be the main points you would need to tell me. But anything else you could think of why, any theories on why else the Chinese might have not been interested in colonizing and taking over the rest of the world? No, okay, it's fine. I'm totally fine. Those are the main ones I would give you. There are some historians that try to focus more on the cultural aspects, right? They say that culturally things like, being an explorer were just not highly valued in China. Like the Chinese culture didn't value that very much. So then why would you do it? There's no cultural incentive to do it. Whereas in Europe, there was a lot of value in like going to an unknown place, encountering savages and coming back with stories, right? People could make money just off of going to a place nobody else had gone to and writing up about it, right? And so some scholars focus more on the cultural elements. I'm not, because I tend to think like when you're going to make money off of something, that's more powerful than the cultural elements. So, but I want to at least point it out that if those things interest you the most, there are a lot of scholars who kind of focus on that. I open up. So they were known for travel, not ocean travel, right? Not that kind of travel. The Chinese are traveling within the continent, within Afro-Eurasia, but also not to a large extent. Yeah, Shanghai was their main explorer, their main history of explorer was there. But also think about it, they don't need to, right? Everybody comes to them, everybody wants Chinese silk, Chinese porcelain, like the rest of the world wants Chinese goods. They don't want anything Europe has, right? Like the cloth Europe has is far inferior than the Chinese silk. So why would you want that? You might want to trade in India for some spices, but you also have spices. So it's not as huge of a drive, right? So what do you need to travel the world for?
To conquer it, maybe.
And they don't have that drive at that time, right? They're like, because China really isn't one place either. You have multiple ethnic groups and you have multiple political interests at the time. So it's tricky. It's tricky. Whereas the Europeans start getting a taste of like, oh, wait, we kind of like this, right? And then it becomes a huge incentive. Yeah. So anyways, all right. So that is the central question in world history, right? But there's a lot more to explore here, right? One of the things that happens is when the Americas get integrated into the global network, right? It's not just the global economy that changes, it's also a lot of the sexual politics, right? When you have people from different racial and ethnic groups coming together for the first time, what are they going to do? The answer is usually sex, right? And sex and sexuality can be a powerful political tool. It's powerful culturally because it creates all kinds of different groups of people, right? But it also is a political tool that can be used. And it was used. It was used politically and culturally, right? It could be a tool of assimilation, right? That is something that we can see very clearly in American history, right? How do a lot of immigrant communities become Americanized? Well, one of the ways is through intermarriage, right? Through intermarriage. The thing with sex, though, is that it's always a fight. Not everybody agrees on who should be having sex with whom, whether it's okay, and what you're going to do with people, right? It's always a fight, always a fight. The key, though, is that at this point, right, we tend to think of sex now as like a private thing, right? Whatever people do behind closed doors is their business. That would have been a total foreign concept to people in the 16 and 1700s. Sex was not private. Sex was public. Your neighbor has a right to know what's going on behind your door. The government has a right to know what's happening behind your door. Why? Why do you think that they believed that the government had a right to know what was happening in people's bedrooms? No? Any hypotheses? Vic, when was the Genghis Khan? Genghis Khan was earlier, much earlier, because at that point, yeah, the Mongols had basically settled down enough that they had become part of the populations all over Afro-Eurasia. But I had a good question. Christopher says Cheesemate back in the day. Oh, super crazy, right? Because on top of it, like their houses were not soundproof. Everybody and like close together, right? So everybody knew everybody's business. Like you could not get away with like sneaking somebody in at night or whatever. Like it was just not gonna happen. Yeah. So some of it would be, but also this is how nations worked, right? Kids were needed as a labor force, right, to farm, but also to work. Kids provide population so that you can run your wars. How are you going to have effective warfare against another group of people if you don't have enough soldiers? You need people to be reproducing for it. And so the government has always really cared, whatever that form of government has been, is on who's having sex with whom, how often they're having sex, what are their kids like, all of that, right? People in governments really, really cared about all of that. So I'm going to give you one example today, because we can't talk about sexual politics everywhere. So this is the first time I'm going to be focusing on something that's happening in what is now the US, but in particular, what's happening in New Orleans. Right? New Orleans is a really interesting place in world history, because although it's in modern day US, it's initially colonized by the French, right? And everybody wants New Orleans, right? The Spanish are in Florida, or what is now Florida, and they actually want New Orleans. The English are up here in, the original 13 colonies over here, and they also have an interest in New Orleans. Why does everybody want poor little New Orleans down here?
Because it's close to like a Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico, which is like good for sea trading, sea routes.
Yeah, it really has actually a really central location. It gives you a port access to the Gulf of Mexico that connects all of the trading going on in the Gulf. So in the Caribbean, right? All of the trading that's happening in the Caribbean, it gives you a port to another body of water up here, the Mississippi. The Mississippi comes all the way down here to New Orleans. And so this body of water can be used to transport goods into what is now the center of the United States and all the way up into Canada. So it actually connects all of this chunk of land, right, what is now Canada and the US, to the trading happening in the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic in a very easy way. It's easier to bring down your goods up and down the Mississippi than it is to ship them on carts across the continent. Right, so this is why everybody wants a piece of New Orleans. The French got there first, and so they technically have the legal and possessive rights over New Orleans. Right, this is kind of a map of New Orleans at the time. So this is the river that comes all the way down, and it then connects to the Gulf of Mexico. This is a French map of New Orleans. Here, New Orleans is really interesting because everybody wants a piece of it. You have people from all over the world, right? You have English people there who are trying to get control of it. You have Spanish people there. You have the French, and then you have native populations. On top of it, because you're on a port, you also have a lot of Black, both free Blacks and enslaved Blacks that exist in New Orleans. So it's a cosmopolitan, huge, really diverse city. Right? It was like one of the key cities in the world around this time. Technically, in most of the colonies, interracial relationships, so both marriage and sexual relationships, would have been illegal. There are codes, the Black codes, that dominate like the legal framework all over colonies. And in New Orleans, you had laws that made interracial relationships illegal. Right? And yet they were happening, right? You can't tell people not to have sex because they're going to have sex. So most of these relationships that I'm going to talk here are illegal, but happening, and some were more okay than others, right? If a white man has a relationship with a free Black woman, it was typically okay. Why would that one be okay and accepted, even though it was illegal? It was okay. So a couple of things. One, most people saw those relationships as temporary. They were very common though. New Orleans was one of the places where interracial relationships, they were not new, they were not weird, they were not odd. Like people, like visitors might give weird looks to interracial couples, but interracial couples were very common in New Orleans. However, for most of the white men in these relationships, they viewed them as temporary. Like, you know, if I'm a French man and I'm in New Orleans, I'm only here for, I don't know, maybe a few months. And then I'm going to go back up north to continue my fur trading, my fur hunting. Right? If I'm a Spanish man, maybe I'm here just for a few months, or I'm here for a few years. And then I'm going to go back to Spain where I have a Spanish wife. But while I'm here, maybe I find someone that I have a relationship with. I might even have kids with this person, but the entire time, I know it's a temporary relationship because I'm going back to Spain. And it helps there then that a lot of the migration from Europe to the Americas was men, right? The French are primarily sending men to the Americas. The Spanish are primarily sending men. The English are a little bit different. They're actually bringing families over, but if they're going to get to New Orleans, it's primarily men. Okay. Now, so that one's okay. And in New Orleans, it's more than okay. Those relationships were common. What about a white man having a relationship or a sexual or romantic relationship with an enslaved woman?
Woman was seen as property.
The woman was seen as property. So that's why also I put in rape here. I put in rape. Historians have actually in the 90s is when historians first started talking about it, about how that's a really unequal relationship, right? When the slave owner wants to have sex with a female slave, can she say no?
No, she's not allowed to.
Yeah, she would get beaten, she'd get sold, separated from her family. There's all kinds of consequences that could happen from saying no. And so, because early on, some historians tried to say that like some of these women wanted those relationships. But when you look at the power dynamics, a slave has zero power in that relationship.
That, and there'd be consequences if they say no. So it's all fear based.
Absolutely, Lily, that. So it's right, but that was really common, right? Those relationships were illegal, by the way. White plantation owners were doing something illegal when they were having sex with their female slaves. It was illegal, but people knew about it. Usually everybody on the plantation knew that the master was having sex with a slave, right? Usually everybody in the town, in the community knew. The plantation owner's wife knew that her husband was having sex with the slave. And it was tolerated. It was okay. Why? Any hypothesis about why that kind of relationship, although illegal, was socially okay? No? Well, you guys
Did it have to do with fear?
So some of it with fear. I'm like, you guys would make terrible colonizers. You're not thinking like colonizers. Because it didn't upset the hierarchy. right? In a racial hierarchy in the colonies, white men were at the very top, right? It was both a patriarchal and a racial hierarchy. So white men were at the very top, white women right below. So white women didn't have the exact same rights as white men, but they were white. So they were still at the top, towards the top. Below that would have been anybody with some sort of white blood. So maybe they were born in the U.S. Maybe they have a little bit of native blood, but primarily white parents. There'd be basically any kind of indigenous mixture with white would be in the middle. At the very bottom of the racial hierarchy were Black people, right? Because Blackness was associated with slavery. So even free Black people were at the bottom of the racial hierarchy. So when a white plantation owner was having sex with his slave, his Black slave, I'm like, that did not challenge the racial hierarchy.
Even if they have children, the children does not challenge the hierarchy?
Yeah, it didn't, because a slave became a slave via his mother, right? Via their mother. They people that were born into slavery had an enslaved mother. So it didn't matter that the dad was a white plantation owner, the child of that relationship would still be a slave. Yeah, and that was seen as like, okay, because his children are going to be slaves like their mother, then that's okay. The white women, not all of the wives were okay with their husbands having sexual relationships with their slaves, but what could they do? A white woman might have a lot of power, but her white husband has more power than she has, right? But actually, most of these women were raised to know that it was okay for their white husbands to rape their slave women. It was okay and it was common, right? In fact, Thomas Jefferson. So I like using Thomas Jefferson for all these examples because he just provides an example for so many things, right? So most of you hopefully know he had children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. It's actually a terrible story. She was a teenager when he first started having sex with her, raping her. The reason he had access to her is because her mother was owned by his wife's father. I know, Sally Hemings was technically the half sister of his wife. When they got married, he inherited a bunch of slaves from his wife's family, and it included Sally Hemings. Everybody knew that Sally Hemings was the daughter of the plantation owner. So actually, a lot of people would remark when they would see Sally Hemings that she was light-skinned, that her skin was very light. And she was supposed to be very beautiful. We don't have any images of her, but she was supposed to be really beautiful. And so when Thomas Jefferson took her to France, that's supposed to be the beginning of them having sex and having having some sort of relationship. But if nobody was surprised that he took her with him because she was so beautiful. So totally normal. But then the children of those that resulted from those sexual relationships were slaves. So most people were totally fine with it. Now, what about a white woman having a sexual relationship with a free Black man? I had the answer on the slide, but I quickly tried to exit after I was paying attention.
Well, that's not acceptable, but I'm just going to guess and say because women didn't have any rights. So it's like, well, women can't do anything they want, just like, I'm assuming that. Is that correct?
I'm like, like 9 times out of 10, that's the right answer. And it's partially the right answer here. Yeah. So yeah, a white woman having sex with a free Black man was not socially okay. Not socially okay at all. That there were occasionally those kinds of relationships. And when they occurred, the community made sure that people knew that was not okay. And basically made sure that relationship ended. In part because women were so regulated. Yeah, basically a woman has no rights, right? And even if, nobody, let's say she's not married, so she doesn't have a husband to stop her, and her dad or her brother is not going to stop her from having this sexual relationship, the community would make sure that, no, you're not welcome here. Not welcome here. You're not welcome in the town next over. You're not welcome anywhere. Right? Because who she's having sex with, people cared. Part of the answer is also racism, though. Right? For a white woman to give birth to a partially Black child was seen as a terrible sin, a terrible thing, because she was diluting the white race. Right? The woman was in charge of white purity, maintaining white purity.
Meanwhile, men are making all these interracial babies, and oh no, they're not. They're still pure. They're not messing with that at all.
Yeah. It's totally like doesn't make sense, right? When you look at it and you're like, wait, this is illogical. If she's diluting the white race, then so is he's having babies all over the place. But the idea was that the women were the ones who were responsible for the continuation of the white race. And because she was free, right, because she was not enslaved, her children would not be enslaved. And so she was creating all these free interracial people, and not okay.
The logic behind it reminds me of the logic behind the food makes you who you are thing.
Exactly, where you're like, you're being ridiculous, that doesn't make sense. But it's justifying your racism. So everyone went along with it. And not everyone, we have to be careful. Like not everyone went along with it, but enough people are going along with it, right? This is what was happening. And then Vic is asking in the chat, was it because even if the Black man was free, he was still not seen as a human being? Yes. Right. In the North, and like in the US, in the northern states, slavery was illegal in a lot of the northern states. But that didn't mean that there was racial equality in the non-slave states. There was still a lot of racism. And you had a lot of people that, for example, hated slavery, even abolitionists. You have a lot of people all over the world who are part of abolitionist movements. They want to end the slave trade. They want to end slavery, but they still don't believe in racial equality. They like that became such a part of the way, especially white people, but the way everybody in different parts of the world thought. Right, that anti-Blackness becomes so embedded in people's minds that it was, even people who were against slavery would have still been racist. Yeah, and that is why, like, a lot of scholars talk about global anti-Blackness, that this was really happening worldwide. Yeah. Now, what about a white woman having sex with an enslaved man? If a white master can have sex with a slave, could a white woman have sex with a slave? No. Yeah, Vic?
I think it does it have to do with the fact that they were both being looked at like how do you say it? Because the master would usually what's the word? There's a word for it. Patrol, I guess they're slaves, and the fact that they patrol both the slaves and the women, it makes it even less acceptable.
Yeah, and part of it, he's in charge, so he can do it, right? Yeah, Solomon, it was a social death for a white woman to engage in any kind of relationship. And if she had been having sex with a slave, it would also be rape, by the way. That relationship would also be rape, because the slave, even if he's a man, how is he going to say no to the white woman, right? There were sometimes rumors. We don't have any evidence, like clear evidence of a ton of like white women having sex with enslaved men, but there were sometimes rumors that of a white woman having sex with an enslaved man, and it was like social death too. If there was any kind of rumor, that was it. Like your life in the community was pretty much over. It was looked down upon in the white community, and sometimes there would be rumors, but we don't even have a ton of evidence that it was happening. So if it was happening, it was very rare, and that's how regulated any kind of relationship like that would have been. Like if it was going to happen, it was going to be super hidden, and you couldn't even have a rumor of it happening, or it was a social death for the woman, and it could have severe consequences for the male slave as well, right? Let's say the woman is married and there's a rumor that she's having sex with a slave. I mean, the owner could kill the slave and nothing would happen, or sell him off, or beat him to death, right? And so it was virtually unheard of that anything like that those kinds of relationships would happen, right? But I'm telling you, except or sometimes there was these exceptions where some of these relationships we might have been able to see in places like New Orleans, where the attitude was much more open, and where, because you had such a diverse population, you had all kinds of interracial relationships there. You had free Black men and women having relationships, romantic relationships with Native people, with white people. Like the interracial kinds of marriages and relationships in New Orleans was very, very diverse, right? There's also, do I have time to get into this? Maybe just a little bit. I'll just get a little bit into this. New Orleans provides a really odd space for the French. The French control that colony, right? They want to establish a strong foothold there because the Spanish and the English also want it. Well, one of the ways they come up with to have a stronger control of New Orleans is to have the white Frenchmen marry Native women. They actually encourage it. They even have a chat with the Catholic priests that were in New Orleans, and the Catholic priests would encourage it too. They want the Frenchmen to marry, to not just have sexual relationships with Native women, but to marry them. The French don't do this anywhere else. They only do it in New Orleans, where they're encouraging their men to marry Native women. Any ideas why they would do that? Typically, any kind of interracial relationship, right? Not really allowed. Why would the French government, French officials, and the Catholic Church in New Orleans tell the Frenchmen to marry Native women?
Thinking about colonization, they want to keep that a French colony. They're trying their best to keep that as French and nothing else. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's the key to it, Lilibet. That's actually the main answer is that one, right? They want the Frenchmen to settle, because the Frenchmen they were fur hunters in New Orleans. So they might be in New Orleans for a little while they're selling their furs, but then they're gonna go out and hunt. And to hunt for the furs, you have to be moving up and all over the place. And so in order to establish the strong foothold, they need the men to settle down. How do you get men to settle down? marriage. Supposedly.
I was gonna say supposedly because I'm sure they had wives in France and they're just like, might as well.
Yeah, I'm like, but notice how some of these ideas still linger today, right? The idea is like, oh, a single man is free to do all kinds of things that are totally socially acceptable. But once he's married, especially once he has kids, now he's a family man. Right? Are those ideas still around today?
Yeah, but they're not always followed, right?
Yeah, and that is absolutely true. But this is the idea of the French government, is that we need to get them to settle down, to have families, to be loyal to France. And the best way to do that is to get them married. But now, why didn't the French government just bring a whole bunch of French women over? Get them to marry the French men. Can't you do that?
Too much work. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know.
No, Lily, but that's basically it. French women didn't want to come to the Americas. It's a wild, crazy country. There's all this danger from the natives and all this stuff. And the French government tried. They tried to create incentives to bring the French women to the Americas, and the French women were basically not having it. They're like, no. A few came over, but not a lot. Now, why would the Catholic Church be in favor of this? Okay. This time, Beth can't answer, and Vic can't answer. I need somebody else to answer. Why would the Catholic Church want the French men to marry Native women?
They could convert their religion.
Thank you, Dollar. Yeah, they want more Catholic converts, right? That was one of the main reasons the Catholic Church is all over the place colonizing things too, right? Establishing missions in California and all over Latin America. They want converts, and they're like, actually, when the government comes to the church with this proposal, the church is like, yes, please. They already know that those romantic relationships are happening in New Orleans. They're already happening. French men were having relationships with Native women, but now they can force the women to convert, because the wedding, right, the marriage has to be a Catholic marriage. The men are Catholic, so they are like, aha, we can convert all the Native women if they all marry Frenchmen. So yeah, the other idea some scholars have come up with is that, like, why the Native women in particular, right? Why isn't the goal just for the Frenchmen to marry? What if they marry a free Black woman? Why is that not okay? Why are the French interested in marrying these men to Native women? One of the answers is because the Native women know the land. They know how to farm. They have knowledge that the Frenchmen don't. Other people suggest that it's because of the racial hierarchy. That it's also because, well, if the only choice is non-white women, women who are not white, then the Native women at least have lighter skin. Right? If Black people are at the bottom of the hierarchy, well, the Native women are at least less bad. Right? But it's the same idea of like, okay, non-white people are not as good as white people, and not as preferred, but even within non-white people, there's a hierarchy. Yeah. I mean, even in our modern day, right? This is why I say this history is still important, because interracial relationships, really until very recent history, were not even legal in the US. Right? We had to go through a legal process of legalizing that. Right? So during our lifetime, they've been legal. But during the lifetime of our parents and our grandparents, not so much, right? And a lot of I'm like, I'm in an interracial relationship, right? And now that we have a different attitudes, but it's still very recent. Okay, I will shut up now. You're all free to go, but don't forget the discussion board post for Sunday. Do Sunday by midnight. Sound good? Well, even if it doesn't sound good, you still have to do it or get a 0. So I will stop the recording and you're all free to go.